Dolly Parton, for me, is an icon, kind of a shero, if you will. And many of you who've joined us for our virtual action hours have probably seen one or both of these candles that I keep as I light them as chalices in my office. In preparation for this service, I read countless interviews of Dolly, listened to podcasts, and read her autobiography. It turns out she would not be a fan of my candle practice. In fact, in one interview, when a reporter got really much too complimentary for Dolly's taste, she responded, "If there's something you see in me that's got a light, then I like to think that light is God's light, not mine." Dolly has this incredible ability to embrace the foundational teachings of Jesus in an embodied practice without using those teachings as a weapon, like so many supposed Christians do today. The quote reminds me that we all have divine light within us, and when people see it, humility is the key. Now, I know that traditionally, as Unitarian Universalists in our spaces and beyond, religious language can be tricky, and certainly the G word, or God, can bring up feelings for some. Now, maybe this will help. In her autobiography, Songteller, Dolly explains that she actually sees the concept of God and Santa Claus as highly related. Both of them are icons that we use to pull ourselves toward a better self. Some of you sent in photos today that we saw interspersed in the song, "I Still Believe," because you were asked to send in images of what you considered to be the holy. And dare I say that none of them were bearded old white men playing chess with our lives up in the clouds. Some may believe in an entity, some may not, but as Dolly puts it in her own words, whether you believe in God or not, we need to believe in something bigger and better than what's going on, because we're not doing too hot. We need to try to do a little better. For me, if there is a God for Unitarian Universalism, this would be it. A God that is not necessarily a thing moving the universe independently, but is rather a thing that we don't fully understand, existing between the known and the unknown. A mystery that works with us to push or pull our lives into healing, hope, and justice. I've experienced this concept of God whenever two or more of our congregation are together, gathered, promoting love above all else. I believe that this is the God that would be in alignment with our foundation as Unitarian Universalists. It is the God that exists among relationships and moves through those relationships, working to embody the proverbial heaven on earth. In our faith, we bind and bound our relationships using the practice of covenants. Historically speaking, the Unitarians and the Universalists were two separate Christian denominations, each with their own theological foundations, but both were big believers in God and the sacred stories of Jesus. By the time of their merger, the two faiths in 1961, the Unitarians had moved themselves toward transcendentalism and religious humanism, becoming more followers in Jesus' life, not always embracing a profound belief in the traditional Jewish or Christian understanding of God. The Universalists, while holding a traditional view of God and Jesus, had expanded their belief in universal, all-encompassing presence of love in the world to a point where the merger just simply made sense. So much of that commonality caused the two to become one. It did, however, leave us without a core creed, unlike other Christian denominations, and instead, we adopted a covenantal faith that drives our call to heal the world to this day. Our very own congregation just last week updated and renewed our covenant of right relations. This is a big deal for all of us, and we should all feel very proud. Covenanting is the act of binding our people together, forming a collective that is much bigger than any one of us alone. For me, this is the God that Dolly references in our chalice lighting words, a God somewhere who is hard to see. When I hear anyone speak of God, I think of that sense of more that Reverend Leslie was talking about, a mystery that is beyond all of my human imagination and knowledge. When I do that, I realize that God shows up most in unexpected ways and often not very comfortable or easy ways. Dolly is a great example of how humans and our relationships are tenuous and temperamental, which in turn make our covenants with one another fragile and very easily broken. It takes work to cultivate human relationships. This requires us to become aware of our own individual actions and how they impact others without centering our original intent behind those actions. In covenantal relationships, the results of the actions are much more important than our individual intent. Simply put, the impact outweighs the intent. Dolly is the first to remind us that she ain't no saint, and while she might not recognize it, I think she revels in the covenanting process, a process which sees the breaking of covenant with an acknowledgement of the harm that was caused, followed by the difficult work of accountability, and then restoration of the relationship. There's this amazing podcast available called Dolly Parton's America by Radiolab veteran Shima Oliai, and it is wonderful. In December 2019, one of the episodes highlights the work of a Slate author, Aisha Harris, who traveled to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, to Dolly's wildly popular theme park, Dollywood. While there, Aisha saw a theatrical performance then called The Dixie Stampede and wrote a review for Slate magazine. It is contextually important to note that Aisha is a Black journalist, and the article, entitled Springtime for the Confederacy, is ecstatically funny. In it, she describes the event as the lost cause of the Confederacy meets Cirque du Soleil. It's a lily-white kitsch extravaganza that play-acts the Civil War, but never once mentions slavery. Instead, it romanticizes the Old South with generous portions of both corn on the cob and Southern belles festooned in Christmas lights. I should mention that this article was written in August of 2017, roughly 1 year after the 2016 white nationalist hate movement in Charlottesville, Virginia. Her review chronicles the various events of the evening. The show has horrible references to Western expansion and colonization without once acknowledging the genocide of the native peoples, and again manages to reenact the Civil War without mentioning slavery, well, ever. Aisha Harris's article is hilariously damning. Now, for those not well-versed in Broadway musical theater, her article title is a play on the musical Springtime for Hitler, which is the focus of the Broadway musical The Producers, where two producers try to put on a horrible Nazi-themed musical, Springtime for Hitler, that they were assured would tank. Instead, it receives a rousing success. Aisha ends the review with the following. So while it may be a surprise to the fictional producers of Springtime for Hitler when it becomes a hit, it is no surprise to me that Dolly Parton's very real Dixie Stampede is a hit too, and has been for almost 30 years. This is, after all, the same country where Birth of a Nation was once the biggest box office hit of all time, and where Gone with the Wind still is. Dolly Parton is so right about one thing, Aisha writes. The Dixie Stampede is as American as America gets. When Dolly caught wind of this article, she and those running her company began removing the Dixie name and the North-South Confederacy imagery from the newly named Dolly Stampede in Dollywood. In truth, because the truth is always more complicated, they already had market research showing that the concept of Dixie did not do so well outside of the South. When questioned about this move in an interview, Dolly responded first by acknowledging the business decision, but also lifted up the following quote. "When they said Dixie was an offensive word, I thought, well, I don't want to offend anybody. This is a business. We'll just call it the Stampede. As soon as you realize that something is a problem, you should fix it. Don't be dumb. That's where my heart is. I would never dream of hurting anybody on purpose." To me, this is the heart of covenant. Listen better, learn better, do better. Engaging in a covenantal relationship is difficult, and we will likely screw up over and over again. But if the relationship is important, then we must make amends and begin again in love. Our country's constitution is arguably a kind of covenant. However, unlike a religious covenant intended to bind people together, my ancestors, who were white, intentionally wrote people out of the Constitution, and only through amendments have we been trying to right those wrongs of the past many years. But I don't think we're doing it right. A covenant must be mutual. All of the parties have to want to be and should be welcomed to the table. Dolly admitted the harm caused and acknowledged she did not want to continue doing the problematic thing. Those who are white in our nation can't even stomach to learn our own history, rich in complexities that must be understood so that we do not repeat the vileness of our past. Entire swaths of people were omitted from the very covenant that we hold so dear as the thing that binds our nation together. And yet, we relinquish Black history, which, let's face it, is American history, to the shortest month of the year. How can any of us expect things to improve if we cannot find humility and bravery like that demonstrated by Dolly? The story of the Stampede name change demonstrates for me Dolly's tenet of love in her faith. It's a love that transcends categories, those categories that humans try to build around one another. It's a love that we are hoping to cultivate in today's meditation with Miranda. And it's a love that Dolly explained when recently asked about the Black Lives Matter movement. She says, "Well, I understand people having to make themselves known and felt and seen. And of course, Black Lives Matter. Do we think our little white behinds are the only ones that matter? No. Our nation is undergoing a transformation that I pray deepens and continues, much like Dolly's willingness to learn and adapt her behaviors with grace, forgiveness, and authenticity. The story of the Stampede reminds me again that American history is nothing without understanding its complexity. I continue to pray and work toward a transformation of our union so that one day the history of all of our people will be lifted up throughout the year and not sequestered to a single month, the shortest month at that. To paraphrase Dolly's music, perhaps the light of the clear blue morning is not just something that happens, but something we have to actively work toward. There is magic in Dolly's persona, in her music. It has been said that few performers have successfully found a way to cut across differences in their fan base like she has. Those who follow her music and stories are broad and diverse like the fabric that is this American life. So, even though Dolly won't like this, I'm going to take these candles and light them. The first candle I will light to remind myself of that unconditional love for myself that Dolly holds so dear. And that second, to make me remember to focus that unconditional love outwards into new and existing relationships that we have with one another. And now I'm going to invite us all to just dance.